you very much for this really kind introduction. And I have to say, I'm pleased that I'm lecturing right now, given jet lag and all. There would be the danger that I fall in sleep. I can't because I'm lecturing, but if you do, I'm forgiving. Okay. I want to thank Rima Faber, Henk van den Belt, and Jonathan Pieke, right, for their kind invitation to give a lecture at this wonderful conference, for all your efforts in organizing it. For us as the Classic Reformed Theology Research Group, which, as you mentioned it already, but it's because of a premature death of the late Willem van Asselt that I chair it since 29 May 2014, and I think it's important to mention Willem van Asselt. The work on the synopsis and what the research group did would be unthinkable without him. Also, he was behind this volume Reformed Thought on Freedom. He was behind this conference in 1997, where Richard Muller has been, I think, for the first time in Utrecht. And that's the conference which later was the Reformation and Scholasticism. In 2001 it was published and so on. So yeah, he should be here now, Willem van Asselt. It was really premature. 29 May 2014. Well, and it is a great honor to co-organize this conference together with Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary. It's such a wonderful place here. Also the library I just have seen. I trust that in the future you will take also care to get these old prints protected against sunlight and humidity from finger and so on.
We want to make it accessible.
Yes, you can do both. Okay. And we are excited that we can mark the 400th anniversary of this very important theological handbook from the aftermath of the Synod of Dordrecht. In my lecture, I will discuss how the Utrecht theologian Gisbertus Voetius received the Leiden synopsis. And my outline is quite simple, so I didn't have a handout for you. I have 3 points. First, I provide some relevant biographical information about Voetius, and second, I examine Voetius' relationship with the 4 primary authors of a synopsis, and finally, I briefly discuss its brief Voetius' reference to the synopsis on the Imago Dei as just one of the examples. We have to restrict ourselves. So the first point, the biographical notes, and in this learned audience, the theologian Gisbertus Voetius, or without Latinization, Gisbert Voet, does not need a lengthy introduction. Foot, that's like in English, just what I have here, wrapped with my shoe. And but it would be good maybe to have a fresh up of a memory of some of you. So I give some information. The Utrecht professor is considered one of the most important Reformed theologians of the 17th century. As Todd Rester, being in this very room, puts it, we not only could say with a bunch of Anglophone scholars that Voetius is, quote, the John Owen of the Dutch, unquote, but it would be even more appropriate to conversely call Owen, quote, the Voetius of the English, unquote, given, quote, his scholastic erudition, piety, orthodoxy, and scholarly output. Thank you for it, unquote. Already in the 19th century, Albrecht Ritschl saw in Voetius, quote, in all respects, the highest achievement of Calvinism in a church of the Low Countries, and Wilhelm Gass described him as the solitary pinnacle of Reformed scholasticism in the Netherlands. For Johannes Heinrich August Eprath, Alexander Schweitzer's opponent, quote, Reformed scholasticism as a whole reached its peak and highest development, unquote, with Voetius. Finally, in the early 20th century, Otto Weber, the Barthian Otto Weber, characterized Voetius as the most significant personality among the Orthodox Reformed dogmaticians, who was, quote, comparable both in character and greatness with Johann Gerhard, unquote. He, of course, in Germany had the Lutheran theologians as a reference point. Such superlatives should, of course, be taken cum grano salis. However, it should be borne in mind that the Dutch Republic played a leading role in 17th century Europe in cultural and scientific terms, perhaps even more so than England. Utrecht developed into a scientific and religious center, with Voetius as a leading figure. While the 30 Years' War raged in Germany, and university life slackened in its aftermath. In Germany, it took almost 100 years to have the Cartesian debate later, so it was later. As Papa Ultrajectinus, as Voetius was occasionally referred to by his opponents, he succeeded. It was a pejorative term, you got it. He succeeded, despite many setbacks, in advancing the program of a nader Reformatio or further Reformation, and in shaping an entire generation of pastors in the early or pre-pietistic sense. Voetius was also Primarius Professor Theologiae in Utrecht for over 40 years and rector of the young Utrecht universities 3 times. He was born on 3 March 1589 in Heusden, a fortress city near Den Bosch, and his childhood was marked by the Netherlands' struggle for independence during the 80 Years' War. His talent was recognized early on, and scholarships enabled him to complete the trivium and quadrivium of the Artes Liberales at the city's Latin school. Shortly after his 15th birthday, Voetius brilliantly passed the entrance examinations of the Leiden Collegium Theologicum in April 1604. In Leiden, Voetius eagerly profited from the expensive offerings at the young university founded in 1575, and I have to say, 150 years after the founding of the University of Leuven, my adopted home city. These offerings included not only theological education on a high level, but, and this was the paper of Riemer Faber, excellent courses in early modern humanist philosophy, including Scaliger, who Voetius often quotes, also with in a positive sense. In 1611, so it's 7 years later, Voetius returned to Heusden and took on his first pastoral charge in the nearby villages of Vlijmen and Engelen. On 5 May 1612, he married Deliana van Diest. She was also quite famous family, with whom he would have 10 children, 2 of whom, Paul and Daniel, would later hold important professorships in Utrecht. 5 years later, Voetius was ordained as pastor of the church in his home city Heusden, where he served for 17 years as one of the most influential pastors of the Dutch Reformed churches. Not only was he heavily involved in synodal work, both on the provincial and national levels, but he also served as a reformer in 's-Hertogenbosch, better known as Den Bosch, where he engaged in a lengthy debate on ecclesiology with a renowned Leuven professor, Cornelius Jansenius. Furthermore, he wrote several important books during these years, both in Latin and the vernacular. After almost 33 years of pastoral experience, Voetius was appointed as professor in theology and oriental languages at the newly established Utrecht Gymnasium Illustre in 1634. Famously, Voetius accepted not only this appointment, but also gave his programmatic inaugural lecture entitled De Pietate cum Scientia Conjungenda. 2 years later, the Gymnasium Illustre was promoted to a full university, of which Voetius was one of the founding fathers. Voetius served as a professor for no less than 42 years, until his death in 1676. Next year in Utrecht we will have a conference, 350 years of his death. He was also rector of the university during 4 different stints, and somehow he found the energy to combine his busy academic work with an ongoing part-time ministry as pastor of a Reformed church in Utrecht. It's a pity that Adrian Niele is not here, because he would like that, but he knows that already, of course. In his rich oeuvre, Voetius engaged in contextual theology. Thus, he was involved in the major theological controversies of his time, including those with the Remonstrants and Socinians, with Descartes and the Cartesians, with the federal theologian Johannes Cocceius, with Samuel Maresius and the Magistracy, and with Jean de Labadie, to mention only the most important ones. Most of his works are based on scholastic disputations. In these disputations, Voetius was in constant discussion with theologians and philosophers from various traditions throughout the centuries and in his own time. In doing so, he made full use of a medieval toolkit. That's the term that Willem von Asselt liked to use, a medieval toolkit of scholastic distinctions. His erudition is stunning and extraordinary. He also worked to introduce Puritan literature to the Dutch Republic. As mentioned above, Voetius can be seen as a main academic proponent of the Later Reformatie, a renewal movement with some similarities to Puritanism, although the exact nature of this movement has been debated in recent scholarship. The next point, Voetius and the authors of the Synopsis. During his Leiden study years from April 1604 until April 1611, Voetius had the opportunity to attend the third and fourth cycles of disputations presided over by the Leiden professors of theology. Less than 1 year before his arrival in Leiden, Lucas Trecatius Jr. and Jacobus Arminius joined Francis Gomarus together, forming the theological faculty at the oldest university of the Dutch Republic. Voetius came when the third repetition of 46 disputations had almost ended. At the same time, Gomarus presided over in October 1604 his well-known disputations on the doctrine of predestination, and it was a random disputation responding to a regular disputation held by Arminius in February 1604. In contrast to Arminius' disputation, the disputation given by Gomarus took, as I already suggested, took place outside the established order. The fourth and fifth repetitions of disputations, however, overlapped in full with Voetius' study years in Leiden. The fourth repetition lasted from December 1604 until January 1607. It was presided over by Gomarus, Trecatius Jr. and Jacob Arminius. The fifth and last repetition started in February 1607. After Trecatius' death in September of the same year, Gomarus and Arminius continued, and after Arminius' death in October 1609, this cycle of disputations abruptly ended. It does not come as a surprise that Voetius consistently sided with Gomarus in this conflict with Arminius. His lifelong high esteem for Gomarus did not mean, however, that Voetius would not also appreciate Arminius' theology on several points. In his Thersites Haotontimoromenos, in English, Thersites, the self-tormentor, Thersites being, the striking character from Homer's Iliad Book 2. In this book, which Voetius wrote in his first year of his professorship in 1634, he repeatedly referred positively to Arminius, placing him in contrast with a later remonstrance whom he opposed on various theological issues. And the 6 disputation cycles, in total 5 repetitions, in total 6 cycles, in Leiden from 1596 to 1609, can be seen as predecessors of a cycle of 52 disputations, which later was published as the Synopsis, as you know, and we heard that this morning with Don Cinema already. And perhaps it's good at this point to mention, actually I have been asked by Henk to do so, that the current project of a classic Reformed theology research group focuses on the 6 disputation cycles from 1596 to 1609, and focusing on the disputations on divine providence. We labeled this project as, quote, Teaching on Divine Providence at Leiden University, 1596 to 1616. As a research group, we edited, translated, and annotated a sample of 12 disputations covering each of the cycles. We are already finished with the preparatory work, and we hope to move later this year to the final stage, during which Matthias Mangold, Henk van den Belt, and I will edit a volume for publication in the same series of Brill, in which we also published the bilingual annotated edition of a synopsis in 3 volumes from 2014 to 2020, which is missing on the book table, but you find it in the library. After the 6 early cycles of disputations and the Synod of Dordrecht, the historical context had changed, which triggered in 1619 Leiden University's theologians to launch a new cycle, we heard about that, of theological disputations, following the model of the previous 6 cycles. Antonius Valleus and Antonius Thysius had been appointed professors in Leiden immediately after the Synod of Dort, and Andreas Beck joined the faculty in 1620. Johannes Polyander was the only theologian on the faculty who had already taught there before the Synod of Dordrecht. And actually, he was one of the teachers of Voetius in Leiden. As to the new cycle of disputations, the Leiden professors worked according to a carefully devised plan. This is evident in the fact that the catalogue of 52 public disputations, which were to begin in 1620, was printed as front matter in the inaugural addresses of Valleus and Thysius. And there is a wonderful article by Don Cinema Henk van den Belt on the cycles of disputations that is required reading, I think, for everybody who is interested in the synopsis. And the outline of a synopsis, published 5 years later, meticulously reflects this plan. It is under debate, however, whether the printing of this cycle was intended from the start. I think it was, and that Stenlin has some very good arguments for that. But it's debated. Similarly, the meaning of a comparative from purer in the title is debated. Is it just the positive decree purer, as a kind of amplification, or does it express the claim that the theology defended in these 52 disputations is purer than the cycles of the earlier cycles that included disputations from Arminius, and especially purer than the theology of the Remonstrants? Anyway, it is perhaps interesting to mention that Leonhard von Ricinius, a pupil of Voetius, would publish in 1661 a quote, Synopsis Purioris Theologiae Remonstrantium ipsorum verbis tum expressitum saepe refutata, which 1 year later was also published in Dutch, with an even more provocative title, De Fäule en Ziel verdervende Leer der Nieuwe Remonstranten. In English, this would read like the filthy and soul-destroying doctrine of the new remonstrants. So that's impure. Referring to a later development, the so-called new remonstrants, later development of remonstrant theology that, according to Reisen, had deviated significantly further from Reformed orthodoxy than the Armenians of the early 17th century. By the way, but I should keep an eye on time, the remonstrants were often seen as crypto-Socinians. In his extensive oeuvre, Voetius repeatedly referred to the Leiden synopsis, although it must be said that these references are less frequent than those to, most notably, Augustinus is mostly cited by Voetius, but when also philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Julius Caesar, Scaliger, and Herod, medieval theologians such as Peter Lombard, Aquinas, Bonaventure, and Duns Scotus, Jesuit theologians such as Fonseca, Molina, especially Suarez, and Becanus, deviant Reformed theologians such as Arminius and Faustinus, and Voetius also quite often referred to Socinus, and last but not least, Reformed theologians such as Calvin, Beza, you say, Sanchius, Polanus, Junius, Gomarus, Macrovius, William Ames, and William Twiss. And so these are cited far more often than the synopsis, at least in the disputations that are broadly related to Voetius' concept of theology and doctrine of God. All the same, Voetius surely considered the Leiden synopsis as a very important handbook for his students. Thus, in the preface to the first volume of his Disputationes Selectae, Voetius in 1648 explained that the synopsis was among those works that he recommended to his students and should be most commonly used, quote, in the academic course to shape and clarify their understanding of the commonplaces, unquote. Other such works included the Thesis of Gomarus, the collection of Disputationes by Macrovius, Amesius Medulla and Conscience, Johann Cloten's Idea of Theology, the catechetical commentary by Ursinus and Pareus, and Johann Diefenbach's Catechetical Maleficium. These authors also directed his students to hold exercise of examination and disputations upon them. More advanced students should read Daniel Tilenius's Syntagma and Calvin's Institutes, which was in particularly worth studying in their years of ministry. A similar list of theological works which Voetius used in his classes is included in his disputation, the Theologia Practica, which he presided over in 1646 and republished in a third volume of Selecte Disputationes in 1659. The list is slightly different, but the prominent place of the synopsis is unaltered. Most notably, Voetius now included also works which he used in his Collegia Electica, most notably the Summa Theologica of Aquinas and other scholastic volumes. Of the four authors of a synopsis, Voetius was undoubtedly the closest to Rivetius. Thus the first volume of Selected Disputations was dedicated to nobody less than André Rivet. It was he who recommended Voetius for a position as professor of theology at the newly founded Gymnasium Illustre in Utrecht. In the meantime, Voetius was still involved in an ongoing debate with the famous Leuven theologian Jansenius. I already mentioned it, but I have reason to come back to it because Voetius admired his Catholic colleague's magnum opus titled Augustinus, but he felt the need to defend the legitimacy of the Reformed churches against attacks from Catholics. And so in 1635, Voetius published a massive volume titled Desperata Causa Papatus, in which he demonstrated, to Jansenius' amazement, an astonishing mastery of patristic authors and texts. Voetius trusted Rivetius enough to send him the manuscript before publishing, asking for feedback. Rivet was impressed by Voetius' thorough work. Rivet supported Voetius also on other issues, including the debate with his Groningen colleague Samuel Maresius about the church properties and the confraternity of Den Bosch, and in 1668 Voetius emphasized that he, quote, both owed and beard immortal thanks to Rivet for his support, end quote. At the same time, Rivet was the only one of the four authors of a synopsis whom he didn't meet when he participated as one of the youngest delegates of the Synod of Dordrecht. He was one of the youngest, not the youngest. You know, Caspar Sibelius and Adrian Hoffe were younger, but it's often said in secondary literature that he would have been the youngest. To be sure, Rivet was invited to the Synod, but as with all potential French delegates, the French king did not allow him to attend the Synod. Only one of the authors of a Leiden synopsis already taught in Leiden when Voetius was studying here, namely Poliando. Although Voetius appreciated him and also would admire his intensive work on the proceedings of the Synod of Dort, he admired Gomarus and Junius much more. The ironic Junius he considered, quote, the greatest theologian, unquote, of his time. Little is known about Voetius' relationship with Thysius. We know more about his relationship with Valleus, and now it gets interesting. This was quite mixed. On the one hand, Voetius certainly appreciated him as an esteemed theologian. On the other hand, he had troubles with Valleus' position on divine knowledge, which came, in the eyes of Voetius, pretty close to the Jesuit concept of middle knowledge. In his lengthy disputation on Scientia Media, together with Twises de Scientia Media, the by far most extensive discussion of his Molinist concept. So in this disputation, that was in various ways endorsed by virtually all Jesuit theologians, the concept of Scientia Media, where and one of those who did it, it was most famously did it of a Jesuit was nobody less than Francis Suarez. So in this disputation, Voetius repeatedly refutes the position of a theologian whom he refuses to name with his name. This is very unusual for Voetius, who usually calls a spade, but here he consistently speaks about, quote, the most renowned man, vier Clarissime. When I studied in detail this disputation in the 90s of the last century, I also can't believe it. Of course, I tried to figure out who this anonymous most renowned man would be. You already guess it. Of course, it was nobody less than Valleus, what becomes evident if you compare the quotes and paraphrases Voetius gives with Valleus's Loci Communis. Another problem Voetius had with Valleus is that the Leiden theologian seem to defend in the Synopsis in Disputation 24 on divine predestination an infralapsarian position, perhaps slightly to the exclusion of a supralapsarian position. It is true that the Synod of Dordrecht allowed for both positions, and was also for Gomarus' supralapsarism. We were discussing it this morning, for instance, and this becomes very clear if you study the Acta of the Synod, and we are all looking forward to even more insights we can gain in future as the huge project around the background documents of the Synod, in which Don Cinema is so heavily involved, progresses. Voetius has a quite interesting position in this regard. Although the 5 massive volumes of the selected disputations do not include a single disputation on the doctrine of predestination, and that's just another argument contra Alexander Schweitzer's central dogma thesis, which is no longer tenable after Richard Muller's apt and scathful criticism, we can find a few passages in which Voetius defends Gomarus and explains that actually the infralapsarian and supralapsarian positions do not exclude each other. The infralapsarian position very well reflects the Salvation historical order and can, according to Voetius, perfectly be complemented by the supralapsarian position, which expresses the theory of action according to which what is prior in intention comes last in execution. What is prior in intentio is posterior in executio. The infralapsarian theologians are simply saying less than the supralapsarian ones, but not necessarily something different. Furthermore, the supralapsarian position is not necessarily more harsh or even deterministic than the infralapsarian one, an association that is very prevalent still today in most secondary literature on this issue. Everything depends on the concept of a divine decree, and if a divine decree is not necessary but contingent, as Voetius takes a lot of pain to explain contra both the Jesuits and Remonstrants, then the supralapsarian position is not threatening either. In fact, in the eyes of Voetius, it is simply a matter of necessary truth, theologia necessaria, which by definition cannot be threatening. God always finally comes to his goal, but this does not imply that he necessitates human choice. Note, and I have to mention Duns Scotus once, but I promise it's not more often. Note that also Duns Scotus, in contrast to Aquinas, holds to a supralapsarian position, and even defends a supralapsarian Christology. And he is very well known for his open conception of human free choice, but this would be another paper I have to admit. So I was just in the break speaking with Richard Muller, and he said that he wrote an article using, may I say that, Richard? Using the term inclusive supralapsarism. I think that is precisely what we find here with Voetius. And you also had the right label for it. I didn't come up with a label. The third point, and it's a briefer. Voetius and the Synopsis on the Imago Dei. Time is progressing, but I do not want to conclude this lecture without introducing one of Voetius's more substantial references to the Synopsis. In the 5th volume of his Selectae Disputationes, he included Disputationes Theologicae de Selectis Quibusdam Problematis in 12 parts, defended in 1648 in response to attacks by Maresius, who identified a long list of paradoxical claims of Voetius. One of these supposedly claims of Voetius, for which Maresius blames him, is this, I quote, "Original sin is a complete and all-encompassing deprivation of the divine image. Peccatum originale esse plenam et omnimotam imagines divinae privationem." According to Voetius, Maresius here engages in a, quote, "most foolish play on ambiguity," unquote, thereby distorting the meaning of Voetius' saying. Voetius further explains that the expression imago Dei can be understood in a more broad and a more strict sense. Taken in the broad sense, quote, "it denotes all those things which not only formally constitute the image of God, but also those which pertain to it fundamentally or by presupposition, and those that follow consequently," unquote. Voetius here refers, next to Polanus, to the 13th disputation of a synopsis by Theseus on free choice. Taken in the strict sense, however, the term imago Dei, quote, "signifies rectitude, righteousness, holiness, and perfect conformity with the law of God," unquote, as described in Ephesians 4:24 and explained in the Heidelberg Catechism. Taken in that sense, it must be said that the imago Dei is indeed lost by the fall of the one Adam and, quote, "restored by a second Adam through a new creation," unquote. However, if we take it, quote, "in the former, broader signification, it cannot be said that it is entirely lost," unquote, as Ursinus most aptly explains in his commentary to the Catechism. At another place, Voetius, together with Ames, argues that human beings lost in the fall what could be called a natura secunda, but the natura prima, the formal core of human nature, cannot be lost and is alienable. Is that right? Alienable, so it's not. Yeah, that's the thing. I knew that something was wrong. Thank you. This includes free choice as an essential human property. Not even God could, by his potentia absoluta, deprive a human will of its formal freedom. This resonates with a synopsis, although Voetius goes into another disputation which is dedicated to the freedom of will in more detail with sophisticated and helpful explanations than the synopsis does with Thyssen's disputation on free choice. But this, again, would be another lecture, and there is also a publication on that already. In sum, my last sentence, in sum, it can be said that Voetius had much appreciation for a Leiden synopsis and its authors, most notably Rivet, and has good reasons to have the synopsis on top of a list of the doctrinal handbooks he recommended to his students and required them to read. Thank you so much for your attention.